Welcome to Press Review on Reaction with me, Iain Martin. I'm editor of Reaction. I'm joined by my colleagues Mattie, Brignal and by Alastair, Benn. Press Review is the show on Reaction where every week we pick our stories from around the world, or pieces of writing, or they can be podcasts or anything, just stuff that has grabbed us in the previous 7 days or so, and stories which we think illuminate bigger trends or reveal something interesting about what's happening in the world. I'm going to come first to you, Mattie. Just before that, I'm just going to say that if you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, it's really simple. Just press the subscribe button below. Mattie, what's your first pick of the week?
Yeah, so it's by Natalia Vasileva in The Telegraph, and the headline is Fortress Russia, How Vladimir Putin's sanction-proof Moscow Leaves the West Toothless Over Ukraine. And it's a really interesting bit of analysis. So she focuses on something that's been a bit overlooked, I think, in the discourse so far about Russia and Ukraine, and that is how Putin will respond to Western sanctions and how much of an impact it's actually going to have on Russia. What she points out is that there's been a lot of hype from the West about how impactful these sanctions are going to be. But if you look back to 2014, when Russia annexed Ukraine, sanctions were imposed, but they didn't have much of an effect. Russia had huge oil revenue reserves that it used to cushion the impact. And similarly, this time, the Kremlin is gathered a lot of gold together, has massive gold reserves, and also $630 billion of foreign currency.
Yeah.
So there are ways around all of this. And the nuclear option, as it's often pitched, of cutting off Russia from the SWIFT international payment system, that might not even have as much impact as people have been giving it credit for, because Russia has developed its own parallel payment system since 2014.
Yeah.
So, and also the share of Russians who are worried about Western sanctions has halved since 2014. So there are just big question marks about whether this tool in the West arsenal is going to be as important as we think it is. I think she possibly overstates the case a little. I think Putin is going to be caused a few headaches by sanctions, at the very least. They are going to hurt. But the crucial thing is that Russia has a contingency plan, just as the US and the EU, or Europe, I should say, are planning for Russia possibly cutting off gas supplies to Europe by hunting around for gas reserves from elsewhere. Russia also has a solid plan in place. And so I think we may be underestimating Putin's hand a little bit. And that's what the piece sort of brought up.
So, as you're saying there, when Russia annexed the Crimea, the sanctions didn't have quite the effect that was predicted. And as you highlighted there, Putin has spent a while, and the Kremlin has spent a while, amassing gold reserves. And I keep hearing this. Actually, I've heard this several times in the city and at Westminster, that the SWIFT sanction is not really the sanction powerful weapon that the Americans or the West necessarily thinks. Also, Tim Marshall, our columnist on Reaction, who writes every week on geopolitics for members of Reaction, Mattie, he's written also about this great question on what happens if Putin does. This is more on a military basis, but what happens if Putin does press the button for invasion?
Yes, he has, and this week he's focused on the Ukrainian, and how that might all, from Russia's point of view, how it would play out on a military front. But it just highlights how this whole thing is so incredibly risky for Putin. I mean, firstly, he's got to weigh up the chances of success on a military front, even if you forget all the political fallout. And yes, Russia is far superior in terms of arms to Ukraine. But if any sort of incursion or war starts to incur a heavy toll on Russian soldiers. I mean, his popularity is dipping at home. He's not popular. So it really could be curtains. Well, maybe not curtains, but not good news.
So is that possibility that the Ukrainians, even though they couldn't necessarily defeat superior Russian forces, could run something like a guerrilla war against Russian occupation, which the Russians have experience of in somewhere like Afghanistan. So it's not straightforward, is it? And that they would necessarily accept being occupied, even if it's only a partial occupation. I wonder whether he's actually looking for a way out. And there's been a lot written this week about negotiations. So involving France and Germany, and the Brits are on a sort of diplomatic mission as well. The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. So we'll see in the next week or so, and I'm sure we'll be returning to this subject next week. Your first pick, Alastair, is from the Times.
It's Alice Thompson's column this week on rule breaking and government, and saying that, basically arguing that the government has made people who maybe stuck to the rules against their better instincts look like fools, I think was her formulation.
Yeah. And
I think it really captured just one of those great mood capturing pieces. So you just read it and you think, yeah, this is, I think, really, even if it's only 20 or 30% of the population who are sort of thinking that, then it really captures it.
Yeah.
And I think, I was very lucky not to have had a serious, a marker in my life that missing would have been, death of a relative, or birth of a child, or whatever, these key rituals. I was lucky not to have had to miss any of those things. But, I think it's unimaginable for the people who did, what that means. I mean, I was reading the other day about the French philosopher Montaigne's vigil that he made for his best friend Etienne de la Boétie, who died of the plague at a young age. And like these best friends, famous friendship down the centuries, and a sort of model of friendship for Montaigne in his life. And he knew that de la Boétie had the plague, and that he could have, that there was a possibility of contagion. But because he was his best friend and he was dying a pretty mournful and terrifying death, he stayed there for many days to sort of watch over him. And it just reminds you that being present, for example, for people's deaths or dying alone, it's good reasons why until 2020 people would make every effort to make sure people were dying in the best circumstances. Of course, it was an emergency and people made quick decisions, and there were excesses, but it's worth reminding us just what we used to think, I think, about those kinds of markers.
There's that book from a few years ago that was a bestseller, a brilliant book called Being Mortal, which by Atul Gundaway, which is who's a medical practitioner in the US, and it captures that idea of the good death, or the good final phase of life, and what lessons can be learned from ancient societies, but also from ancient societies and cultures in terms of rituals and the way in which the older are looked after. And all of that was really thrown out of the window. In some senses, understandably, initially in the first few weeks, because there was a pandemic where people didn't really understand the nature of the disease. And thanks to the CDC in the US and the World Health Organization, it's now very clear they got it wrong in terms of airborne transmission. A lot of the advice was confused. So you can understand, can't you, Alastair, some governments making up rules which turned out to be too draconian, but the rules persisted through various waves of the disease. We were talking about this Mattie last night, actually, the reaction team, because we were in the pub returning to the office on Fleet Street, of all places, returning media to its roots. That's reaction. And we were discussing this. But that Alice Thomson piece really does, I thought it was a really striking piece, that it just expresses beautifully the sense in which so many of us, okay, some people did break the rules, but so many people in Britain just assumed that those setting these most draconian rules in peacetime were observing the rules. And as she says, we feel like fools when it emerges that that was not the case.
Yeah, no.
Because what underlies a lot of the, sorry, Mattie, but it underlies a lot of the anger, and it will not be the government defence, for the various government outriders over the last couple of weeks, saying, we're getting on with government, and isn't it kind of ludicrous that we're now over focusing on these kind of stories as they emerge?
Yeah,
and,
Mattie, you had a take on Alice's piece.
Well, I mean, it actually, what it brings me on to my next piece is linked to the next piece I'm gonna raise. But no, I thought, as well as capturing that anger, it also hinted at how we're going to see lockdown and lockdown's legacy is I think starting to come into focus. People who were very adamant that lockdown was the right thing are now, in retrospect, now there's been a little bit of time between the lockdown and to reflect on it, are now seeing it for what it is, which at the extremes was a pretty inhuman system of restrictions. And I just think it's the start. Pieces like Alice Thompson's suggest that its legacy is sort of aging. It's going to age like a fine milk, and I think that the longer we go, it's going to look worse in hindsight.
Yeah, I think this does remind me quite a bit of it's bigger because the restrictions were more draconian, and it's a pandemic, just not involving human health and not just money. But it reminds me of the atmosphere a bit after the financial crisis of 2008, and there's this tension in politics and in society where people take very different attitudes, contrasting attitudes to these things. Sometimes some people always want to move on after disaster, and that is a very human instinct. It happened, mistakes are made, move on. I can see the case for that, but also without just over obsessing about the recent past, if you don't try and document it, categorize it, and understand it while the memories are still relatively fresh. Of course, historians in 30, 40 years are going to be astonished by what happened in the West and beyond, and the cruelties that were inflicted, but also presumably they'll be surprised by the pace of the innovations on things like vaccines and all of those positive things which happened as well. But if there's a real risk in the politicians' desire to just move on from it and just say, well, no one's interested in that. It was all 2 years ago. And then those lessons are lost. And something similar could happen again. And as Alastair's been saying throughout the crisis, really from the first phase, lockdown introduced, and all the different manifestations of it, was a medicalized, technocratic view of human existence, which is very popular actually at the time. I think in time you may be right, Mattie. It becomes less and less popular the more that people learn about it and learn how a lot of it was over the top. But Alastair, we were talking, weren't we, last night in the pub about precisely this, about the politics of lockdown and the politics of COVID that have been created.
Yeah, there's an odd aspect to this in that vision of a scientific appointed elite almost coming down from the high mountains and delivering their wisdom to the public and communicating it, and then going back up again, is something that's been around, well, especially in the West for over 100 years. It's been a sort of vision that's been sort of latent in all kinds of bits. Discussions about the future of the computer in the 60s, full of these, caution about the idea of a network society where appointed figures will just decide, what takes place in that network.
Yeah.
Whether it's like Jean-Luc Godard in Alphaville, or, there's a little known Swedish book as well called by Hans Alfven, who was like the computing czar in Sweden, who wrote a book called the Vision of the Computer. I would ask everyone to go and seek out reading about that. It's a really fascinating little cultural vignette about a guy who was at the forefront of the information revolution, was part of, was instructed by a social democratic elite who were the brightest and the best of their era to construct a new automated society with the help of computers, which would have extensive referencing systems, who would begin to run all kinds of labor. And he writes this book sort of talking about how the computer is going to make humanity redundant, and there'll be a tension between the ideals of the information world and the kind of messy realities of, the drives that we all have, the messiness of politics. And I think his sort of big idea is that the only thing that's worse than politics is no politics. And I think we've got a bit of a taste in the last couple of years of what happens when there is that part of the debate sort of gains in ascendancy. An idea that we can bypass some of the kind of deep political questions that we're always having around how we treat young and old people, how we think about inequality, all that stuff, by deferring to the science, which Boris was one of the Western leaders complicit in that idea,
which was because he had perhaps deservedly so a chaotic rule-breaking reputation, and then having made a mess of the very first phase of the pandemic, and being potentially in a lot of trouble with public opinion as people realized the mistakes that had been made, then he obviously, in his terms, in terms of survival, had only one option, didn't he? Which was to be as, in public anyway. We'll come on to the latest on Sue Gray in a moment, I'm sure. But in public, at least, to be Mr. Rules, and as tough as possible, on the public, to almost exaggerate for effect, to counter the widespread notion that he's a bit of a shambles. Now, we haven't really got into Gray and all of that. I'll just say a little bit about that. It's we're recording this on Friday afternoon, when of course the Met have asked Sue Gray, the senior civil servant who is investigating the Downing Street parties, which have been endlessly sort of played out in the media, to not publish the full report, or to publish only a redacted version, so she could end up publishing a report into the Downing Street parties, which doesn't really mention anything too specific or incriminating about Downing Street parties. So all of this is kind of playing out, and I'm sure we'll talk about it next week. But I think what has happened there is that essentially people who've been interviewed on one basis, on an HR and employment basis by Sue Gray because of the civil service inquiry, then when the police took an interest, prompted by Gray, who was passing them information or keeping them informed, if you're one of those people, you can then say, or your lawyer can say, well, hold on, this has now shifted. I gave that information on one basis, not under caution. It's now the subject of a police investigation. It cannot be fair for the original HR employment Sue Gray inquiry to be published in full. It's a ludicrous situation, which probably buys Boris some time. But as I say, that's all happening now. So we'll talk about that, I'm sure. We'll talk about the fallout from all of that next week. Mattie, you just wanted to highlight for your next pick a story from New Zealand, which is also about COVID.
Yes, it is, and it ties in with what we've just been saying. So it's a piece in The Spectator by David Cohen, and it's called "In Fortress New Zealand, Faith in St Jacinda is Starting to Fade." So it's Cohen having a pop at Jacinda Ardern, who's been held up as a model leader, really, in the international press, and coddled a little bit, and really made quite a fuss of, especially with her handling of COVID, which has been very very restrictive. So Cohen points to new new isolation rules, just in. If you test positive now in New Zealand, you've got 14 days of isolation in your home.
14 days.
14 days. It's 14 days, so a full 2 weeks. If anybody else in your household are automatically a close contact, they have to isolate for 14 days plus another 10. And this is irrespective of testing. The borders are still completely closed. New Zealand citizens still can't go back home. And this is despite 77% of the population being fully vaccinated. And Cohen says that Ardern's popularity is slumping. He suggests it's because of these continued restrictions, but I suspect it's actually not, which is almost scarier in a way.
Yeah.
He asks how she's got away with it all this time. And yes, there have only been 52 COVID deaths in New Zealand, which is very impressive. If you want to rejig your whole society around fighting one disease, that's very well done. That's a very impressive result.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, what I find really interesting, is the lack of dissent and debate in New Zealand. So amongst scientists, the public, politicians, about whether this is the correct approach.
Yeah.
And I just wonder how these countries, so New Zealand and Australia, who's also taken a very, very hard line on COVID, how they're going to cope politically and psychologically as we move into the next phase of the pandemic, living alongside COVID, and how long this absolutist stance is going to last. I don't know what you think, Alastair. I know you've thought about the sort of Australia and New Zealand COVID complex a bit, but I don't know what you think.
Well, I think Australia, there's just a sort of pragmatic thing that seems to kick in with Australia. They are getting back to it, but their hand was forced to an extent by the emergence of the Delta variant. And you remember, it apparently entered Australia through a cab driver going to the airport. They had a huge outbreak in Melbourne, and I'm sorry, in Sydney, and then in Melbourne. But so Scott Morrison pitched, the Australian PM pitched quite quickly from a sort of enjoying the zero COVID approach, but doing a very slow vaccine rollouts, very cautious, to sort of going, well, once we get to 70-80% vaccination, we can just open up society. Invoking the language that we're very used to here of roadmaps and steps, in terms of reopening. Yeah. So, Australia is in terms of the kind of ability of relatives to visit, Australia is in a better position than New Zealand. I know plenty of Australians over here who have really, there has been a humanitarian, there's been a humanitarian problem there for people abroad, not being able to see their relatives, being pretty heavy-handed approach in terms of some of the, in terms of access. And there's also the hypocrisy of, there have been some stories about sort of VIP access for certain individuals being able to enter Australia without the same kinds of problems. If you're filming or you're a sports team or anything like that.
I wonder though, Alastair, if it's permanent, because so my assumption had been, and maybe this is just a crazy assumption from Britain, where people are increasingly, well, relaxed is the wrong word, but life feels like it's starting to get back to something approaching normality, and people want to travel. Difficult at the moment, but there is that eagerness. And I wonder if actually in Australia or New Zealand particularly, you're not going to see that, because the population has been so terrified. And if 52 deaths, very low number of deaths, is the tally to be protected, and you can't then have 200 or 500 or 1,000, because that equates with government incompetence, and most people seem to, the polling suggests, have bought into the idea of essentially closing down the country. But maybe it's a reversion to the era pre mass air travel. I mean, it's not that long ago, in the era in which I grew up, when I was a kid, when everyone had relatives in Canada or Australia or New Zealand, and there was it's a post-empire thing, a British view of this, that you didn't see them very often. And maybe once every few years, if they were well enough off to come back to Britain for a couple of weeks holiday. This was the era before the idea became commonplace that you could just hop on a plane in Melbourne and then go for a weekend in Thailand and then go to Dubai and then hop over to London. And just this era of international travel is relatively recent. It's a development of the last 20, 30 years in its mass scale. And maybe people in New Zealand and Australia are going to end up being pretty happy to just sort of settle, try and prevent people coming in and not leave as frequently as they did. Do you think so, Alastair?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a kind of reversion to that. I mean, the other set of questions this sort of brings out is, and it's something it's sort of rarely discussed, is there's an awful lot of cherry picking in terms of when we talk about sort of authoritarian responses to the virus. We tend to look to Australia and New Zealand because we have a close affinity with those countries, massive cultural links. There's effects on people we know. Everyone's got an Australian mate who lives in London.
Yeah, it's terrible.
So we reach for those examples quite easily, and you can there's been some successes in terms of minimising COVID mortality. I'm not sure on excess deaths in general how successful the public health response has been in Australia and New Zealand. I'd have to look. But if you look into Africa and you look at the record of travel restrictions between countries which have had relatively porous borders, where a lot of informal labour has been used to go with the seasons, or people travelling large distances for working in informal circumstances in markets or wherever, the impact of lockdowns, which did happen in Africa, it wasn't, particularly in countries in West Africa, the record of these kinds of restrictions in terms of the chilling effect on people's movements has been absolutely dire in terms of its effect on the poorest and on that huge class of people in Africa who depend on traveling, again, informal traveling labor, traveling large distances to earn not very much, and then to bring it back to their families, or to send it back. And I think that's kind of lost when we focus on advanced societies like Australia and New Zealand, which can obviously manage some of the social costs of lockdowns and restrictions through the fact that, New Zealand's a very prosperous part of the world. People live in relative luxury. Apart from, obviously there are problems of inequality in New Zealand and deep disparities between the Pacifica and Maori communities. Yeah, and in terms of vaccine coverage, actually, and distrust of the state. If you look at the record of some of these measures in societies which are fragile, that has to sort of be part of the debate as well, and part of our kind of assumptions, I think. Yeah. What does it mean, for example? And then there's another question, which is, what does it mean to make vaccination effectively a condition of entering most European countries? Not just a vaccination, but then a booster, and then I assume the doses beyond that every 6 months or a year. Yeah. a continent, Africa, which is going to be one of the most populous, Nigeria, massive population growth. It's a constant of huge dynamism and potential, is effectively going to be cut out of access to kind of Europe through formal ways of getting there, because vaccination rates are super low. It's incredibly expensive to come to Europe now. If you're not vaccinated, you face all kinds of problems. I just think, it's a piece with the way in which the Omicron variant, our immediate response was to effectively shut down travel through a large swathe of countries in Africa. Yeah. Restrictions which remained in place for, over 10 days to 2 weeks after the thing had been completely endemic in Europe.
I know.
And it's just like, yeah. Anyway, see what I mean? Getting into that debate is something that I think we're not really done in the West, because it's just not. I mean,
it's going to become very confusing in Europe, isn't it, Mattie? When Britain's taking quite a relaxed attitude, but then some countries like Sweden have had far fewer restrictions. Anyway, it's going to be. It's not going to disappear anytime soon. This confusion about where you're travelling to. Do you need to be? Is double vaxxed okay? Do you need to be triple vaxxed? Testing or not to test? That's testing as a concept is fading in the UK. Or do you think will people just adjust to it and still want to travel despite all the hassle?
Well, I think there are going to be at least two speeds of countries emerging from all this and starting to put these massively faffy travel restrictions behind them. UK obviously leading the way in that respect. What I'm just interested by is public discontent and how that's going to manifest itself. I mean, in France, there are going to be some restrictions lifting, I think, in February, but we're still talking about having to show your COVID pass to go and get a coffee. And I just wonder how much of an effect that is going to have, a lingering effect on mentality towards COVID. Yeah. You see big protests in Germany at the moment. And I just don't, and I hope that in the next few months that these countries are just a few months behind us, and that in the next few months, come the summer, come the warmer weather, they can really start opening up. But
let's hope so.
Let's hope so, yeah.
Let's hope so. So my next pick, which I'll just go through quickly, it's something I wanted to flag up. The link is below. You're watching Reaction press review on YouTube. If you're not a subscriber on YouTube, hit subscribe below. You may be listening to this on our podcast as well, where it also goes out. And if you're not a subscriber to Reaction, you just visit the site and become a full member of Reaction. You get my weekly newsletter. You get Tim Marshall's brilliant weekly column on geopolitics. You get Maggie Pagano, our colleague, on business and much more. And all of our columnists and writers and invites to events and live events are getting going again in February, so we will email our members details of all of that. The next thing that I want to flag up is from Engelsberg Ideas, which, if you haven't encountered that yet, it's the site that Alastair and I work on, the Reaction team work on for a rather brilliant Swedish foundation. And Engelsberg Ideas, EI, publishes great long reads and essays from academics, thinkers, commentators, also shorter notebooks as well, and podcasts. And listen out for the History Lessons podcast, which interviews some of the world's leading historians. But the thing that I wanted to flag is from this week, Alastair, which is by Sam Gregg in the US. On one level sounds a rather obscure subject, Jacques Rueff's quest for monetary order. But it's one of the things I love about Engelsberg Ideas and how eclectic and interesting it is. It focuses in on someone who's arguably France's most important 20th century economist. And in an era of high inflation, in which the central banks are starting to realize that they've lost control of the process, Sam, in his essay, and the link is below, uses Rueff as a way into explain how dangerous inflation can be politically and what it unleashes when, in terms of potential populism and disruption to the constitutional order and public opinion, when it really gets going, which of course he discusses the 1920s, which is the most obvious example of precisely that in terms of what happened with the monetary crisis in Germany, hyperinflation 21, 23, and from that then flows all sorts of political disasters. But he has this really interesting way, Alastair, of talking about it in terms of rights. That actually, and I hadn't quite thought about this as someone. I'm not a gold standard person. Don't necessarily, I'm not a gold bug who believes that there's purity in a return to the gold standard, which is how money used to be underpinned in the West. But he does raise this interesting moral point that if you just devalue money and governments just sort of go on essentially just monetizing the debt, it does produce conflicts.
And also, it's a really interesting insight into the phenomenon which sort of happens quite a lot after the war is the kind of French elite testing out alternatives as they saw it to a kind of US-led Atlanticist West, and that kind of testing out took lots of forms in energy, security, and a dimension of it I hadn't thought of was again on monetary policy. This dissatisfaction with the Bretton Woods system. Anyway, particularly relevant at the moment with Macron's, actually invoking a lot of that with talking about a new pact for Europe, a strategic depth of the French relationship with European power. So it's a great.
And he also reminds. I mean, I'd forgotten this, that in the 60s, of course, you have de Gaulle. I mean, this is in Julian Jackson's biography, and Jonathan Fenby's also brilliant biography of de Gaulle. There's discussion about the US dollar's hegemony, and essentially de Gaulle took the view that was extremely dangerous and did advocate going back on the gold standard, advised by Jacques Rueff. And there's a lovely conclusion to Sam's essay, where essentially he's saying that if you don't worry about this stuff, and if you just take the view that the debt can always be monetized and inflation is just sort of what the system does, and central banks will always keep the show on the road, what could possibly go wrong, that has a civilizational cost, that actually what you need to underpin a sensible, orderly society and commerce and properly functioning markets it's not just a practical question, it's a moral question in terms of thinking about monetary policy. So as he says, monetary order wasn't everything for Rueff. His writings reflect deep awareness of the ways in which culture, religion, philosophy, music and literature influenced civilizational development. Nonetheless, he insisted the threats posed by monetary disorder were more than economic. For him, civilizational growth was impossible without monetary order. In our age of quantitative easing and negative interest rates, that is an insight worth pondering today. So that's by Sam Gregg on Engelsberg ideas. Alastair, your next quick pick is on Essex, I think, from The Guardian.
Yeah, it's a great piece by Gaby Hinsliff, who is grew up in Essex. She's responding to a kind of a rebrand. I think it's just being launched by local government, which is rebranding Essex as a sort of county of culture, where the Peasants' Revolt really got started, a place of fine wine, fine restaurants, great seafood, all the rest. And sort of says, well, as far as this goes, of course, Essex, there are kind of many dimensions to Essex, as the Essex of marmalade and the Essex of
Tiptree,
Towie, but she says that it's actually kind of which I've just really, such a great point. She says that you shouldn't devalue the extent to which Essex has almost reinvented itself in the last 30 years as the kind of face of brash confidence, New England, adept on social media, stars on telly, all that stuff. And that also reflects a side of Essex which has kind of always been there, but it's and that shouldn't, that can coexist with the kind of the actually quite identikit kind of culture forum adverts for places, which almost everywhere has a kind of sleek image of castles next to restaurants, next to little tourist spots. Also, I mean, another question is that the east of England, I know it's a short bit, but just it's a part of England that fascinates me, because we're moving to a funny place where the west of England, the kind of old rural heart of England, is becoming almost Arcadianized. It's becoming so posh, full of art galleries and Hauser and Wirth dealerships in Somerset, and it's not really so much of a farming world anymore. It's not. There aren't these big farms. That a lot of them have been broken up. So the west of England is becoming almost like has a sort of playground quality. The east of England, whether it's from Lincolnshire going down through to Norfolk, is really where a lot of stuff gets made that we eat. It's a real, it's a kind of the powerhouse of our rural world, but it's a very neglected part of the world in terms of culture, with its kind of Dutch architecture elements, its seafaring heritage. Norwich is a city of culture destroyed by Steve Coogan through his stereotypes.
I think that's a brilliant observation. I mean, Mattie, you'll agree, coming originally from Saffron Walden in terms of this question of the east of England. I think Essex doesn't need a rebrand. It's massive. It's underrated as an area anyway. But maybe it does need a rebrand if lots of people don't understand some of the beautiful countryside that's there, and it's a really, really interesting place. But that's a great thought in terms of look east, go east. So much of the focus is on getting out to Somerset, the idyllic kind of London boho banker hedge fund, or the place it automatically look, he said, generalizing, is towards the Cotswolds, is towards Devon, Dorset, Somerset, and actually Suffolk and Norfolk hardly get a look in. What do you think, Mattie, hailing from the east?
No, I think you're right, and Essex doesn't get romanticised in the same way, but I think it's really deserving of some of that. I mean, as you say, the countryside is glorious. A little bit on the flat side, granted, but hey, you can't have it all. I mean, it's lovely. And yes, I'm from Saffron Walden, so I'm going to have to give Saffron Walden a plug now. And I think Walden is representative of a sort of Essex that does meld the two. I mean, you've got your marmalade, you've got your picturesque beamed houses, you've got your all of that in very idyllic surroundings, but you've also got you've got your Greggs. So anything you could want, really.
So the role of the city, that the way in which it connects to the city of London, by which I mean the financial heart, and the way in which, partly because of really some of it is an accident of history, in the way in which the railway lines they weren't planned, they developed organically through private development, and where the lines were sort of punched into the city from, and then the land along that line. I'm fascinated by the subject, wrote a lot about it when I was writing about the history of the city, and then where had a fast-ish link in, then became a cluster of housing. So Essex has always had that connection with the city, and people dismiss it as sort of barrow boys and trader culture, but it's a great example in British life of social mobility, and people coming in from Essex, Hertfordshire, on fastest trains early in the morning, and essentially making the city function and the city fly. That's a big part of its history as well, which means that there's an understanding of money, commerce, trade there. No, I think Essex is underrated. We've agreed. My last pick, just to round us off, is a very quick one, which is from the FT Weekend magazine last weekend, and exactly the sort of thing that I buy a weekend paper for. It's a deep dive, that terrible modern phrase, but really nice piece by Alexandra Heal, which is smaller and smaller gadgets are creating an epic deluge of trash. So rather than her writing a sort of whinging piece about how everyone's got too much stuff and we're all terrible, she really digs in a very detailed way into this question of one specific tech question, which is the question of earbuds, which is headphones and wireless headphones and all that sort of stuff, which seem to break relatively easily. So people have them then lying around, and she goes on a journey trying to get them repaired. And I think it's fair to say that virtually none of the manufacturers, big brands, want to know, because essentially the model works as people just buying new ones every couple of years. But we will have this stuff lying around. She tries various tech shops or electronic shops. No one wants to touch it, and particularly the earbud question, because it's so small and so fiddly. And she explains the tech of how it's glued together and how a stronger glue is used, or a better glue used by Samsung. But generally people don't want to know, so they just pile up in a drawer full of unwanted tech stuff. And then Apple, who don't come too well out of this actually, and she eventually gives up and says, by this point it'd been a month since I added recycle earbuds to my to-do list. So she exhumes them once more, along with an electric toothbrush, 2 tangle sets of wired earphones. The time has come, and she cycles to the Apple store on Regent Street and hands her earbuds in to be recycled, whatever that means. But it's a really, really good piece of Saturday journalism. That's from the FT Weekend. You've been watching Press Review with me, Iain Martin. I'm editor of Reaction. I was joined today by Alastair, Benn and Mattie Brignal, both from the Reaction and Engelsberg Ideas team. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just hit the subscribe button below. Also go to the site, again, link below. And if you're a brand new subscriber and you sign up in the next few weeks, we will send you a copy of Merian Somerset Webb's rather brilliant new book called Share Power, which is about popular capitalism and how to improve the power of share ownership, and teaches people a lot about investment. Really, really good book. But until next time, thank you for watching and thank you for listening.